Games Workshop wants to charge $40 for these books. This is going to be a little bit of a salty video, everyone. So if that's not your cup of tea and you don't like people criticizing Games Workshop, you might want to move on and skip this one. We're talking about the chapter-approved 2021 release. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi. I'm down here in the corner, and today we're talking about the chapter-approved 2021 release and some issues with it. Maybe a little bit of controversy today. It's been a really rocky road for 40K this last couple of weeks. We are coming off at the start of the year a really phenomenal Death Guard release alongside the outstanding January FAQ. But as 2021 has moved on, we've been seeing some relatively blatant power creep out of the latest cycle of releases. More issues with Games Workshop's responses to these issues with their game, maybe culminating in this chapter approved release. To say the last 6 months have been a roller coaster ride would be a total understatement. The chapter-approved books are set for release this Saturday, but we do have basically everything spoiled on Imgur this past week, so we're going to be talking about that today. For those who don't know, a little bit of background behind these books. These are sort of the gospel for matched play 40K. The chapter-approved is split into two sections. The Munitorum Field Manual, which has all of the points values for every matched play legal non-legended model in Warhammer 40K. So that gives the designers a way to iterate on their points values and continue to adjust the overall balance of the game periodically. The other book is the Grand Tournament book, which comes with the Grand Tournament packet of missions, which is a competitively oriented mission structure. Now, that said, it is not actually a tournament format. It is literally just a set of 9 missions and secondary objectives to play theoretically the most balanced games of 40K out of all of the different matched play formats available. Now, the Munitorum Field Manual itself is usually relatively useless. It gets errated almost immediately. This version already has announced day one erratas, and there's, I think, a couple typos in it as well, and not to mention the fact that it is also trying to include points values from as yet unreleased codexes, which means that those points values will basically be superseded immediately. We also get 6 months updates to the Munitorum Field Manual, so this will get totally revamped in 6 months and will be replaced by a PDF document that has basically all of the same information. Chapter Approved 2020 came out alongside 9th edition, and when it came out, it, and especially the Grand Tournament packet, was sort of billed as a tournament format, which, again, it ended up not being, that is going to be able to be iterated on by Games Workshop and improved every year. The 2020 format was totally revamped by that January FAQ, which changed a lot of how the scoring works, which really updated the balance of the packet. Unfortunately, 2020 was not particularly well balanced upon release, but a couple months after release, it did get a big transformative change, and now it is the great format, well, the okay format that we enjoy today. Now, last week we got some previews in a Warhammer community article about some changes to the secondary objectives in GT 2021 that got a lot of people really excited, myself included. I made a video on it. We talked about and wish listed some changes that could be made to the format to improve it. We had some great discussions in the comments about which direction these changes should go in, and I think a lot of people were really excited to see a new thing out of GT 2021. One thing that we did talk about in that video is that a lot of the missions in the GT packet are the biggest outstanding issue. Not the secondary objectives, but the missions themselves. There are a couple of them that are heavily imbalanced. Vital Intelligence, I think, being one. Vital Intelligence tends to be ridiculously favored towards the player going first. There are also some issues with particular secondary objectives, some of which were addressed or at least mentioned in this Warhammer community article. So moving on, let's talk about exactly what we're getting in this chapter approved release. Now, what I'm not going to do is talk about every single change that's been included in the new MFM document. The embargo, as far as I know, is still up, so most of the people who are going to be going over and doing in-depth reviews who have preview copies are not able to do that quite yet, and I think those articles with every single listed points change will come out. That said, I will brush over some of the broad strokes that we're seeing. First off, let's talk about Space Marines real quick, because Space Marines had some really enormous changes to a lot of their most played units, which I think is very appropriate. Just looking at a quick list of changes, some of the most played units were nerfed. We saw nerfs to units like Vanguard Veterans, Chief Apothecaries, Plasma Inceptors, all units that you saw in a bunch of different armies. We saw a couple minor changes to Blood Angels and Dark Angels, some of the most played Space Marine chapters, including Talon Masters and Sanguinary Guard, increasing in points, whereas some of the special characters like Dante and Sanguinary Ancients dropped in points. We also saw drops in points for some of the least played units. So, Gladiator variants went down 20 points, Land Raider variants down 20 points, Repulsors, Storm Ravens, and the Storm Speeder variants also down. This change is great, not only because it's changing the most played units, and especially some units that were definitely a little bit undercosted, but we're also seeing changes to the least played units. And I don't think, honestly, Space Marines really needed much of an adjustment. I do think that they have some very overcosted units that I would like to see downgraded. Space Marines right now aren't doing particularly well in the overall scene. They're very much a middle-of-the-road faction, and they do have a couple wins and a couple top 5s and GTs and stuff like that, but they're not really ripping things up. So while the nerfs to Space Marine units were relatively widespread, they didn't feel entirely earned, in my opinion. That said, if this was the tenor of the changes to every faction in the game, I would be very happy with this document, because it's clear that Games Workshop is trying to equalize the power level, at least internally in the faction. The downside is that's not what we got. Instead, most of the other factions in the game received very minor changes. Some of the most changed factions were ones like Necrons, which just got some very minimal points reduction. The Warhammer community article previewing some of these changes talked about how Warriors and Immortals would retain their 4-point differential. And while it did spoil that Necron Immortals would be getting their Tesla weapons for free, which did happen, neither of those models' points values changed. So despite the fact that this article treated this change to Immortals as a really big deal, and definitely dropped a hint that both Necron Immortals and Warriors would be changing, which would significantly empower the faction, a faction that really needs it, given that Necrons are very middle of the road right now, they didn't do that. We also saw some minor changes to craft worlds as previewed. The Wraith Infantry went down, as well as some of the Aspect Warriors. Fire Dragons, Dark Reapers went down, Fire Prisms, and Night Spinners, as well as the Avatar of Cain. All good changes, but beyond that, most of the changes in the document were very minor. Some of them actually laughably so. For example, Astra Militarum, one of the worst factions in the game, only received a points break to Ogrins, which, I mean, in fair, they needed it, but really? We didn't get anything else? That happened while increasing the points of their most played unit, the Death Rider Squadron, up to 20 points per model. So it's really a wash. Some of the other worst factions in the game got absolutely slapped in the face by changes. Genestealer Cult lost points on Jackals and Pure Strain Genestealers, which was previewed in the book, but nothing else about Genestealer Cult changed. And Tau, arguably the worst faction in Warhammer 40k, got basically nothing done. Riptide Battlesuits were discounted by a single point, as well as some war gear options dropping slightly. However, Hazard Suits and the Storm Surge went up, the Storm Surge going up 50 points. Why? No one was playing that model. It's bad. We also saw some changes to factions that are doing relatively well. Custodes got a little bit of a rebalance. Their Grav Tanks going down, Telemons going up. That seems fair. Telemons are very widely played. It makes sense that they would be a little bit nerfed. But Tyranids also with a lot of points breaks. A faction that does not need it. Tyranids only really being superseded by the most recently released codexes like Drukhari and Adeptus Mechanicus, will already like a top 5 faction and are probably still at least top 3rd, even when Drukhari are running things, but they got points breaks to Swarmlord, to Genestealers, to the Trigon Prime, the Turvagon. They did get a slight nerf to the Dimacheron, but all in all, most Tyranid lists dropped an immense number of points for no reason. And I say that as a Tyranid player. I don't know why Tyranids keep getting these points breaks. It doesn't make any sense. Stop giving us points breaks, GW. The faction's fine. Orcs coming in with some minor nerfs. some rocket launchers going up, including Defcoptas and Killicans, as well as Warbike Knobs getting a discount. Some of the most recent codexes were understandably unchanged. Drukhari and Adeptus Mechanicus coming in with 0 changes. I do appreciate that they were finally able to print the points cost of Reavers correctly. A lot of people were hoping, I think just for the entertainment value, that they would misprint Reavers points cost for a 3rd time. Adeptus Mechanicus also coming in with no changes, and Thousand Suns and Grey Knights, while their listed points did have some significant changes to it, those were quickly changed into errata because Games Workshop had assumed those codexes were out already. They have already received a day 1 errata to this book before it was released to change their points back to essentially where they were at the beginning. So here's the issue with this release. This isn't a dynamic iteration on the game's points to rebalance it. Outside the Space Marine changes, these do basically nothing to address the balance of the game or bring up the lesser played factions. Factions like Tau and Munitorum were essentially untouched. They threw Tau the tiniest tidbit of bone with a 1-point Riptide discount. These factions were shoo-ins for big points breaks that could really revitalize things, but nope, that's not what we got. As I mentioned before, some factions got big points cuts that weren't necessarily in a bad spot. Some other powerful factions like Adeptus Sororitas also got significant points drops, but it should be noted that those are to coincide with their new codex. So definitely take those points with a grain of salt, because either the codex could change them, and there definitely is probably at least one typo in there with the Paragon Warsuit being listed at 240 points per model, which sounds a little bit ridiculous to me, especially after their stat block was previewed and, let's be honest, doesn't look that good. Now, obviously, this release would have been sweet if every faction had received the same level of attention that Space Marines had, especially if it was well-weighted, with the top factions maybe getting a few more nerfs to their most played units, whereas the bottom factions got a couple of additional points breaks. That would have been excellent, but instead, all we got is essentially a Space Marine rebalance with the rest of the game as just randomly assigned points changes to justify being able to print this in a new book and selling it, rather than releasing it as an errata PDF. So with that, let's move on to GT 2021 and some of the changes in this half of the chapter-approved release. So like I mentioned before, the biggest issues outstanding with the GT 2020 format was, whereas most of the missions were pretty well balanced, some of them were pretty heavily skewed towards the first player or second player. Here's the issue with this release, is that there have been no changes made to those missions. Only secondary objectives were changed. And while I will say for the most part they are very positive, a lot of them were basically unnecessary, and I would have immediately traded them for changes that actually repaired the balance of the format. So in this case, I'm going to go over all of the changes in the secondary objectives that I found, and we're just going to talk about them real quick. For the most part, this isn't entirely true. The objectives that changed have also changed names. Line Breaker has been moved to behind enemy lines and now scores you 2 victory points if 1 unit's in the opponent's deployment zone, or 4 for 2 units. So you can sort of half score this one instead of being all or nothing. Domination changed to Stranglehold and requires you to hold 3 or more objective markers and more than your opponent controls at the end of your turn. So there are easier ways to score it if you're playing on a 6 objective mission, because it was essentially only ever played on 5 objective missions, since you could relatively easily hold 3 to 2 objectives to get it. Thinned their ranks moved to no prisoners, which counts the wound characteristic of models that you destroy instead of just the raw number of models you destroyed, but gives no benefit for killing monsters, vehicles, or characters. Seems totally fair, and Grind Them Down remained the same. While We Stand, We Fight got a very minor change, being renamed to the Last. Now it penalizes you for splitting units off. If you pick a unit for To the Last, and then it splits into multiple units, so something like a combat squad ability, for example, you will only score 3 points at the end of the game if one of those components of the unit is destroyed. It also doesn't include drone units. So not only can you not game it that way, but you're also not punished for losing drone units that are attached to one of your To the Last targets. While We Stand rolls off the tongue way better, not gonna lie. We saw no changes to Raise the Banners High, which is a downside because there is an outstanding issue with Raise the Banners, which is that you can perform the Raise the Banners action if a unit is in range of multiple objective markers, and the objective does not tell you how to resolve that. So who knows? I've seen it ruled both that all of the objective markers get banners on them, or that you pick one when you go to complete the action. Investigate Sites moved to Investigate Signal, and this is something that we do have to talk about, because We got in a Warhammer community article a big reveal about investigate sites. In Mike Brandt's write-up in this May 25th article, he talked about how investigate sites could not be performed if there were enemies within 6 inches in the previous version, which is true. If there were enemies within 6 inches of the center of the table, you could not investigate sites. He then talks about how you can perform the action if enemy units are within 6 inches. I am assuming he means of the center of the table. And you score if you can clear the center by the time the action completes at the end of your turn. Here's the thing. With the changes that we see, both of these are technically true, but not really. Previously, investigate sites read that you could perform the action at the end of your movement phase if you are within 6 inches of the center of the table, and no enemy units are also within 6 inches of the center of the table, which is what Mike was referring to previously with the ability to contest the objective. In the new version, both the unit completing the action and any units contesting the action have to be wholly within 6 inches of the center of the table. Mike's right up in the article stating that you could complete the action while there were enemies within 6 inches of the center is technically correct, because if they are within 6 but not wholly within 6, they do not contest the action. But as soon as every part of every model in that unit's base enters within 6 inches, not only can you not perform the action, you also don't score points at the end if they remain there at the end of your turn. And while, like I said, what Mike stated in this article is technically correct, why you gotta do that, buddy? Why you gotta be like that?
Why you always lying?
Games Workshop is a company that, through virtue of their design philosophy, throws so much weight behind concepts like playing as intended. So having this article try to throw this curveball that is misrepresenting how the rule works by essentially using what is effectively like this rules as written gotcha verbiage, it's just so gross. Also talked about in that article was the change from deploy scramblers to retrieve Octarius data, which is a pretty big change. Deploy scramblers, obviously one of the most played secondaries in the 2020 format and has been totally revamped. It now basically scores you 4 points per completed action, which you do in every table quarter 6 inches away from other table quarters. So you can imagine that there's a big 12-inch wide T in the center of the table that you can't complete the actions in. And after the first, you'll get those 4 points for every quarter that you do the action in. This makes it harder in many situations to complete than deploy scramblers because you will have to do it in all 4 table quarters. That said, the floor is much better than deploy scramblers since there's almost no way you don't get 4 points off this objective, and in most situations it's an automatic 8. I think for the most part it is an upgrade off deploy scramblers since those 8 points are actually really easy to get. You don't even have to touch your opponent's deployment zone in most missions. But you can potentially score those 12 over the 10 that you would get off deploy scramblers normally. This feels like sort of an unnecessary change, to be perfectly honest. I would like to have seen more objectives brought up to deploy scramblers level than deploy scramblers being reworked, because this is a little bit of a complicated secondary to parse, but I think it'll play out pretty well. Repair teleport homers has been changed to deploy teleport homers. Now allows you to perform it with biker units, which I think is very appropriate, given that, especially in Space Marines, a lot of the bikers are the models carrying the teleport homers. So that's kind of a cool change. This also allows you to complete it within 12 inches of your opponent's deployment zone, not just within the deployment zone, and you get 2 points if it's within 12, or 4 points or if you are wholly within their deployment zone. So I think good changes there. Assassination is the change assassinate, and now gives you 1 extra victory point if you kill the enemy warlord, otherwise is unchanged. Titan Hunter didn't change the name, so I don't know what the naming convention here is. I don't know what's going on. It did change the distribution of points. Now if there's only 1 Titanic model, you only get 4 points, 9 points if you kill 2, or 15 if you kill 3, so it's a little bit more evenly distributed and doesn't punish 1 or 2 Titan lists quite as much as the previous version did. Bring It Down is totally unchanged, which not only is disappointing because in the previous video I talked about how much I would like to see it changed so that this 10 wound cutoff was moved to a 9 wound cutoff to score 1 victory point rather than 2, but we also saw mention by one of the authors that there were changes to Bring It Down, and there are not. So again, we're seeing this article just totally misleading people. Moving on to the Warpcraft secondaries, we see the January FAQ changes to Abhor the Witch represented, which is nice. Psychic Ritual has been changed to Warp Ritual, which now scores progressively. You get 3 points if you complete it once, 7 points if you complete it twice, 12 if you complete it 3 times, but it only scores 12. This also seems to me like you can complete it with multiple Psychers instead of just one. I'm not 100% sure, and we may need a clarification on that, just given that the rules on who completes actions are super weird. And last, but actually not least, because Mental Interrogation was one of my favorite secondaries, at least my Warcraft secondaries in the 2020 version, it's been changed to Psychic Interrogation, and now requires line of sight, but has a range of 24 inches rather than 18. This is actually a pretty big nerf, since if your opponent's worried about you being able to capitalize on Mental Interrogation, they can just hide their characters and you won't be able to get any points from it. So I actually think that becomes mostly unplayable outside of the situations where your opponent is going to have characters at front and center in their army. So with that, that's literally all of the changes to the Grand Tournament mission packet. I imagine we see the January FAQ changes reflected, but that's it. Super disappointing. The fact that it's only secondary objective changes, none of the primary objectives changed, is a really big issue, especially since I think we were at a point where people were comfortable enough with the GT 2020 format that they could build their army around completing several of the secondary objectives, despite the fact that they weren't very well balanced, for sure. Some of those objectives were totally garbage and you would never take them. But the fact that, the short list of good objectives had basically been settled upon by the community meant that we could start playing it optimally. The issue that was outstanding were those primary objective missions, and those remained unchanged. You can add on top of that these blatantly misleading Warhammer community articles, and it's understandable that this is a disappointing release, to say the least. Now, there's a bit of a rant incoming, so get ready for that. But before I talk about that, normally I would put in the customary, it's nice that we're getting these iterations, and it's good that Games Workshop is able to identify that there are issues with their format and that they are updating them periodically. But I'm really tired of, patting the head of a company valued over $1 billion like it's a kindergartner making macaroni art. So here's the deal. This is not a new version of Chapter Approved or of the Grand Tournament Mission Pack. This is an errata that could have been released as a PDF that probably, including the MFM changes, would have totaled 3 pages. The biggest problem here is this $40 price tag that they're trying to charge you for it. Plenty of other miniature games manage to update their mission packs and game balance without charging additional money for it. And gating it behind this kind of big price tag is absolutely the height of hubris. Now, the core part of this issue is Games Workshop's insistence on printed materials. Because of the additional lead time it takes to compile and print an entire book, this means the developers have an incredibly narrow window to make actual balance changes to the documents. So they end up balancing for a metagame that's several months old. Additionally, because of this, any response to developing meta trends has to be ridiculously turgid. So the developers are disincentivized from making any sweeping changes to the game, which means that big discounts or big changes to bottom tier factions are probably never going to happen. That's because any big changes like that open the doors to mistakes that could take 6 to 12 additional months to repair in the next version of the printed document. In this case, you can compound this issue with production delays that pushed back books this book was supposed to release alongside, and that also makes this $40 price tag pretty ridiculous in light of multiple day one erratas. I imagine that narrow window also steals playtest time from the GT 2021 development, which is required if you're going to be releasing something as important as a new mission into the packet. Fortunately for Games Workshop, there are tons of better ways of implementing a system like this, but unfortunately for us, the company is totally unwilling to adopt them. Making these digital releases with regular updates, probably gated behind a small subscription fee, would make them immense amounts of money, more than their hefty price tag, and massively improve the game. Why the company swears by these outdated, in-paper releases that just make their game worse and less balanced and harder to develop, I have no idea. And honestly, I'll never understand it. But this Chapter Approved release is a perfect example of why this style of release is a bad idea. It's just too bad that we're the ones saddled with it, and that it's doing so much to keep 40K from being a truly phenomenal game. Don't buy Chapter Approved. Don't give Games Workshop money for this shameless cash grab of a release. Between this and Warzone Sheridan, it's pretty clear that Games Workshop is trying to cash in on these hard copy books that they're selling, and it's pretty gross, to be honest. Hopefully they can see the error of their ways, but we do sort of have to vote with our wallet and tell them, no, we're not going to buy a book with 6 sentences of errata in it over the last one. That's ridiculous. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. Rant over, everybody. Big thanks for watching to the end of the video. I also want to throw a thanks out, as always, to my patrons over at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All those people are phenomenal. They help me keep the lights on, and I love them very much. Let me know down below what you think about GT 2021 and the changes. I do think the secondary objective changes are legitimately good. I'm just sort of angry that we don't have any additional changes to improve the format, and that they're gated behind a $40 set of books that really doesn't do anything to actually earn that price tag. I would like to have seen some primary objective changes, but I do think that the game's going to be more interesting to play with these new objectives in mind. Anyway, remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.